All right, guys, this is our last video for the endocrine system, and I wanted to use it to focus on the role of hormones in regulating appetite. And I think this is especially interesting because appetite is the sort of thing that a lot of people mistakenly think is sort of a choice that people make, like how much do I feel like eating today? But if you really think about it carefully, different people eat vastly different amounts of food, right? Take, the extreme examples of a very large, very physically active teenager that's in the middle of a growth spurt and might be plowing through, rather disgusting quantities of food sometimes. And then on the flip side, take a rather small, like very elderly person that spends most of their time sitting in a chair watching TV that eats, maybe a tenth of the amount of food that the younger person does. And so something in these people's brains has to be telling them how hungry they're supposed to be. And I think everyone knows from experience that if you do things like exercise, if you work a physically strenuous, like manual labor job, your appetite's going to go up, right? The more work you do and the more calories you burn through, the more your brain tells you that you're supposed to be hungry. And the entire field started before this, but there was a major breakthrough in the 1980s when a research lab, just sort of by sheer luck, found a mutant mouse that had an obese phenotype. Normally, if you give mice as much food as they want to eat, they might get a little bit on the heavy side, but they don't get this big. This mouse is almost double the size of what a typical mouse should weigh, and as long as you give them access to food, they just keep eating and eating and eating, and it's very difficult to get them to stop. And what the lab that discovered this figured out pretty quickly is that the gene that was mutated in this mouse codes for a peptide hormone called leptin. And the really interesting thing about this is that leptin increases as the amount of adipose tissue that a person has increases. And so if someone gains weight, their fat tissue actually secretes leptin itself, and it'll secrete more leptin as the weight gets added on. Now, what's supposed to happen is leptin acts on the hypothalamus in the brain, which regulates appetite, to be an appetite suppressant. And so this is supposed to work like a negative feedback loop in the sense that you gain weight, you release more leptin. The more leptin you release, the more it should suppress appetite in the brain, which should inhibit food intake, and you should lose some weight and come back down to normal, right? This is the reason that if you look at weight in most people, right, most healthy people over time, if we say this is body weight and we track them over the course of months, maybe sometimes years, you'll generally have people hovering over a particular set point, right? They gain a few pounds, they lose a few pounds. Of course, some people do, gain or lose significant amounts of weight over time. But over the time course of months and sometimes years, it's pretty stable. And so this is another example of a negative feedback loop. And you can see what happens if you break the negative feedback loop and the mouse can't make leptin. And this condition occurs in humans too. It's a very rare genetic disorder, but it does happen. You'll have human children that end up like this mouse weighing, 200 pounds by the time they're, 5, 6, 7 years old because, their parents report that they just scream and throw tantrums uncontrollably if they don't get access to food around the clock. Now, if you add leptin back, right, through injections, this mouse or the human patient will voluntarily decide to just eat less food, right? And so to make this mouse, this is the same mouse. They gave it leptin through injections, and they didn't have to take the food away, right? They could leave the food bowl sitting there, and as soon as they inject the leptin, the mouse will voluntarily decide to eat less food until it goes back to a normal weight. Right, so leptin is maybe the most prominent example of an appetite regulating hormone that acts in the long term, but there are others as well that act in the short term. All right, so we just went over leptin, which acts as an appetite inhibitor or appetite suppressant. There are others as well, and this is going to be relevant when you go through the digestive system. CCK is an appetite suppressant that is released by the small intestine, and it's triggered entirely by the presence of food. And so when your GI tract is physically full of food, it makes sense that that would also, right, inhibit appetite. It's effectively telling your brain, hey, look, we're in the middle of digesting the previous meal, not quite time for the next one yet. Same idea for insulin, only remember insulin levels should rise when your blood glucose goes up, which again should happen right after a meal. And so we've basically got these three different reasons why a person might want their appetite to go down. Their blood sugar's up because they just ate and we need to finish processing that before the next one. That's insulin. Their GI tract is physically full of food and it's not time to eat yet because intestine's still full. Or we've been packing on a little bit of weight lately and it's maybe time to lose some of that weight and decrease adipose mass. Any of those are valid reasons to turn down appetite. It's just that these two, insulin and CCK, tend to be short-term regulators, like hour to hour. I had breakfast, how long until I'm hungry for lunch? And leptin tends to be a long-term appetite regulator, right? You're asking the question, how many calories should I eat overall, like big picture, over the course of weeks and months and longer time points? All right, on the stimulant side of things, the same concept holds true. You have hormones from the endocrine system that can effectively tell your brain when to be hungry. Neuropeptide Y isn't technically a hormone. It's more of a neuromodulator. It's a molecule that's released in the brain. But that's the mechanism for how leptin does its thing. And so neuropeptide Y stimulates appetite. And when leptin levels go up, that's how it has its effect, by turning down NPY levels. Interestingly, that mouse that we saw that was a leptin knockout that just ate and ate and ate, very sad, but if you have a mouse with a defect in the neuropeptide Y gene, it doesn't feel hungry at all. You can put food right in front of it and that mouse will refuse to eat because it doesn't even really know what the feeling of hunger feels like, and the animal will starve to death with a full bowl of food sitting right there because it doesn't have the drive to even pursue food. Okay, and then last one, ghrelin is also an appetite stimulant, but it's released by the stomach primarily, and ghrelin levels go down after a meal, which makes perfect sense. So when the stomach is full, we have less of that appetite stimulant, which makes perfect sense. This is the hormone that gastric bypass is trying to manipulate, right? If you shrink a person's stomach, it only takes a little bit of food to stretch that stomach out and suppress ghrelin release. And so in the end, you can decrease appetite two ways. You can either increase the amount of your appetite inhibitors or suppressants, or you can decrease the amount of your appetite stimulants. Either one will get you to the end result. Okay, so in practice, what does this look like? To try to prove the point that appetite and body weight and metabolism are regulated by the endocrine system and not just by choices that people make. This is a research study, a clinical study, where they took people who were obese to begin with. They had an average body mass index of almost 50, which, for context, a person who's 6 feet tall, that would mean weighing around 360 pounds. And so these people had a significant amount of weight to lose. And what they did was they put these people on a pretty severely calorie-restricted diet for 30 weeks. And after that 30-week time point, they lost, on average, 38% of their body weight. So when they say, massive weight loss, they really mean this was a dramatic calorie reduction diet. These people were eating a pretty small quantity of food, and it was supervised by a medical staff to make sure that they were fine. But the question we're asking is, when someone loses a lot of weight, typically at the end of it, if you interview those people, they'll tell you that they feel hungry and tired and cold and just lethargic and miserable. And the only thing that makes them feel better is eating more food, which obviously they're being told that they're not supposed to do, because that's going to just lead to gaining the weight right back. And so what they were trying to do is ask the question, all right, when a person loses a lot of weight, their metabolic rate goes down. We know that. The question is, does their metabolic rate go down because they're also losing muscle mass? Because muscle burns a lot more calories than fat does, or is there some other reason behind it? And so here, their goal was to cause this massive weight loss with a calorie restriction, but give them enough protein and add in a little bit of exercise so they could preserve fat-free mass. When you see fat-free mass, think muscle, bone, connective tissue. Their hope was that their metabolism wouldn't slow down as much if they did this, and it turns out that it still did. It didn't work. Okay, so these numbers, baseline and week 30, are just the before and after. So at the beginning, they weighed 149 kilograms on average. By the end, they were down to 91. So huge weight loss. And the other part of this that's interesting, this RMR, resting metabolic rate, that's just how many calories a person burns at baseline, no exercise, just how many calories to stay alive, keep your heart pumping, keep your body temperature where it needs to be. And at the beginning of the study, they needed 2,679 calories on average just to stay alive. By the end, they were down to 1,890. And we expected some of that decrease just because they had less body weight, but nowhere near that much. So these people at the end of the study were burning about 500 calories less per day than these researchers thought they should have been, even when adjusting for any weight that they lost. All right, so do some blood work. If you take readings for a handful of different hormones in here, the picture starts to make sense. From baseline to week 30, these people started off with a leptin level of 42.9. They ended at 2.7. Right? Remember, leptin is an appetite suppressant. So at the end of this study, they lost a lot of weight, but their leptin levels were very, very low. If you don't have your leptin appetite suppressant, that means one thing. These people were incredibly hungry, right? Because their appetite suppressant was gone, and so they're craving food. The next thing I'll point out is that they had significant decreases in thyroid hormone. Right, specifically, look at the T3 value is almost cut in half. T4 goes down slightly. The decrease in T3 and T4 means these people are going to be feeling incredibly tired because their metabolic rate is low, and they're going to feel cold because they're not generating enough body heat. Right, and so you can see how this happens when people go on a crash diet and then eventually gain the weight back. They're being forced into a semi-starvation state where they come out of it feeling hungry and tired and cold and miserable. And the only way to fix these things, right? How do you get leptin levels to go up and thyroid hormone levels to go back up? You have to eat, right? And so that's why increasing calories again and gaining some of the weight back makes the person, physiologically and psychologically feel better, is because it gets those hormone signals back where they're supposed to be. All right. So the significant sort of add-on question at the end of this is, well, what's the solution, right? If it's all hormones and we can't really control it, what do we need to do? And the research in this field is growing, but it appears that instead of cutting calories by force, it seems to be that controlling the quality of food is what matters the most. In this example, they did a comparison of two different diets. The consensus diet is like a typical food pyramid, lots of grains and fruits and vegetables, and then build up from there. And they compared that with what they called a Paleolithic diet. Most people have heard of the so-called paleo diet. It's effectively just a whole foods diet of, meat and fish and vegetables and fruits and nothing processed whatsoever. And what's interesting is these people were not forced to reduce their calories. They only were told to eat as much as they feel like until they're full. And the consensus group ate about 18,000 calories a day, and the paleo group ate about 13,500. And so that's a difference of about 450 calories a day that was not forced upon them. They weren't told they weren't allowed to eat, and the people weren't keeping track. Only the researchers were. And so the conclusion is when you give people like real filling foods that aren't processed in any way and don't have really dense concentrations of sugar and starch and fat, this system kicks back in, right? Leptin starts working the way that we want it to, and our person can maintain a relatively healthy body weight by just sort of trusting their appetite. And so it seems like the place where, food goes wrong with humans is the quality of food that they're getting, hyper-processed, highly concentrated calories. And as soon as you strip that out of the equation, this system should work correctly and everything falls into place. All right, hope this was helpful. The next video in the playlist will be moving on to the digestive system, so make sure you keep track of the order of videos in the playlist and subscribe to the channel to make sure you get any updates.